Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. I hope you all had a good bank holiday weekend. Some of you joined yesterday for a really good chat around autism awareness and advocacy, which on a personal level I found very insightful and yeah, just an amazing different perspective to what I have every day as a disabled person, really. And today we're joined by Neal Crowther. So first of all, thanks for joining us, Neal.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Martin.
Where are you calling in from? Are you London?
Yeah, just south of the river in Bermondsey. Yeah.
Cool. So South London, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, we're going to be having a chat all things around equality and human rights as a sort of crux, but I think we're going to go off on all sorts of tangents and journeys. It's going to be an interesting chat. But yeah, Neal, if you just kick us off with an intro to, I was going to blind date mode. What's your name and where you come from?
Well, my name is Neal Crowther. I grew up in the Northwest in Bolton, but I accidentally found myself in London in 1992. So how long was that? 28 years ago. I came here for 2 months and I'm still here.
It happens that way, right?
I live with my partner and my 6-year-old daughter, as we were just saying, in Bermondsey in southeast London. And these days I'm a freelance consultant, working on a range of issues, big focus at the minute on the whole future of care and support from a range of perspectives. Background largely in the field of disability rights, which I sort of tripped up into as well. Probably cover that later.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's me.
Cool. Yeah, it's a great grounding. And yeah, as I said before, we'll sort of start, so when you came to London, what was the work that you first were doing when you arrived in London?
So I finished at university in Hull and was kind of looking around for jobs. I think during that time I spent a bit of time working on a cucumber farm and various other peculiar jobs. And a role came up at the Royal National Institute for the Blind, who was setting up a housing service, the primary focus of which was to support mostly young blind and partially sighted people who were kind of moving out of the RNIB's colleges and other sort of settings, wanting to kind of find a place in the community, and the support that went with it. So my role was really about drawing up relationships with housing associations and the council and others to try and find places for people to move into and then to work alongside them to find the support that they would kind of need to live independently. Which wasn't really dressed up in that way. It wasn't sort of set in that politics or framed in that way at that time, but it's very much what it was about. And I've been reflecting a lot recently about how influential that period has been on me, because as I said, I only moved here for 2 months because it was a temporary role initially. And because it was a temporary role, it was the offices were in a block of flats in North Kensington, which sounds very grand. It wasn't very nice at the time, to be perfectly honest. There was a lot of problems in that area, but it's quite a nice block. And so I actually lived there with about 20 or 30 other young blind and partially sighted people. And because I didn't know anyone else in London, and I was pretty lonely, to be honest, this group of people took me in and supported me when I really needed it. And I think that whole kind of dynamic sort of stayed in my brain all the way through. It just felt instantly reciprocal. And because we were not really trying to provide a service to people, it was all about people's just getting on in their lives. That also very much kind of characterized what the whole thing needed to be. But it was only a few years after that that the kind of politics of disability kind of came in on top of that for me. Somebody gave me a copy of Mike Oliver's Politics of Disablement, and then off it went.
Yeah, and I guess that, for me, the social model was extremely liberating and empowering, that I wasn't the problem and the issue, and it's the societal barriers. And I was taught that in my first job at Scope, and we'll get into some of the politics of disability charities later, I'm sure, as well. But as an individual, it was a really good opportunity for a job. It enabled me to move to London, and that very much Mike Oliver's work really around the social model was so powerful. But I think that theory on its own only goes so far, and as you say, to have had that experience with that group of people in that time, and I imagine that helped to actually assimilate what Mike Oliver's theory and the text meant to in the practical sense as well for you.
I think two things actually. One that may sound slightly controversial, but I think I probably did move into that role. I didn't move. No, I didn't go because I wanted to work around disability issues or disability rights. I'd actually done a degree in housing and social policy, so it was the housing side of
The
it.
housing, yeah.
But I do think I probably went into it with quite what I would regard now as a sort of prejudicial attitude, not necessarily about disability, but about anybody that needs some degree of support. This kind of hero savior kind of
I was going to say,
mentality, there. And or just all with this. We've been talking about this a lot recently, about this idea of people as sort of intrinsically vulnerable in some way or whatever else. And actually, what I did was to provide advice, housing advice to people, often who had become or were becoming homeless or needed somebody to stay. The reason I mention this is that I think, having done that for 2 or 3 years, became conscious of two things. One was, yes, you could always see the systemic factors that lay behind people's situation, which stood in the way of fairness and justice and them having the same rights as everybody else. That was key. But you also saw somebody's own agency within that. And the reason I mention that is by the end of that period, I didn't have this view of people as without agency, as somehow just victims. Very much saw their own role within that, about making choices about themselves and the interaction between those two things. I think that stayed with me as well. You know, we all make mistakes and we all make good choices and bad choices, and we have to live by them. And, you know, but we're all we're influenced by our environment in terms of the ability to make those choices. I think that's the key thing. That's where the social model of disability makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, no, and I think that there's a few thoughts really jumping out. And for me, when I was at university, I was sort of almost on the other side of that world you've described, that there were people coming to provide the care that myself and others needed. And I think they did arrive with that slight sort of, you know, the view of helping others, enabling others. But as you mentioned, you moved to London and you had your own, you know, sort of just getting used to being in a new city, and friendships have formed. And I think, you know, when I look at even right today, I sort of feel that political correctness has got everyone tiptoeing around saying or doing something that doesn't fit within the perfection of what political correctness is, but it stops them just doing and learning, because in the end, that's all that we can do, isn't it? Like, we've all gone through different experiences and learned things from that, and then reframed our view of the world and how we might be able to influence it in different ways for the better. And I know I saw every year there were new care assistants arrived at Coventry University, and it was always that same process, really, that it just ended up becoming friends and equals. And a lot of people said to me, of all the isms, if you like, disableism was one of the quicker ones to remove. That as soon as you actually just sit down and have a chat with a disabled person, those sort of prejudices go away very quickly and easily. The difficulty is getting that sort of societal interaction with disabled people. But be interested what your thoughts are on that as well.
Well, I think we've just hit on it at the end point in a way. I still think there's a huge amount of segregation persists, and it may not be as physical as in the past in terms of people in absolute institutions or special schools, although they are there still. We should never forget that.
Sure.
But in terms of whether our paths cross in everyday life and how often that happens, I think that's the question. I think attitudes change in certain environments more than others. So within social and family circles, within the workplace, within schools, these are places where we have these deep, long relationships. So kind of optimizing that. I think that's important. I was noticing today the Centre for Social Justice has begun some new commission on the future of disability rights, and employment is going to be its focus. And I think we've tended to look at employment as an ends, and I think actually we need to look at it more as a means to ends, as a kind of change agent in itself, and things like that.
Yeah, nobody is like, I am here on earth to work. It's always a means to an end for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also a place where we meet and we encounter one another, or certainly we did before we had to socially distance.
Yeah.
You know. But so I think there's that. I think the other point you were getting to there, there's an organisation I really like at the minute called Camarados, and their director, Math Potts, makes this point. He worked for years and years in homelessness, and just realised that whatever they did materially never really sustained itself, because often what people lacked were good, deep quality relationships. But also what the way those organizations behaved was always to kind of try and meet people's needs. And he's got this really basic insight, and he says, when he meets somebody now who may be on the streets or who may have really profound mental health problems, he doesn't ask them if he can help them anymore. He asks them a favor. He dignifies the person and their worth by recognizing their humanity and asking them a favor. And I think that's the key thing, to sort of recognize we all have needs, and it's better to do it within a web of reciprocity rather than the idea of this kind of charity, really. I'm here looking after you over there, which is just nonsensical and doesn't help.
And I mean, an interesting, obviously, we're both, you're talking about your personal journey of going from Bolton via Hull to London and your first role and the things you've learned, and I'm sharing the kind of, I was at uni and that sort of similar times, and that someone on LinkedIn's made a really important point, I think, because obviously and I'll bring it up so we can both see it. Friendships aren't allowed on care work. I have friends being fired based on crossing professional boundaries, and so obviously there's always different angles and sort of parts of the puzzle, isn't there? In any job, there's professional boundaries and there's responsibilities, but inevitably there are friendships that form from just being in close proximity to people. But obviously with care work, there is that dynamic of sort of, I know a lot of people say it's a personal assistant, not a carer, because it's an economic transaction. And I think we can get too far on both extremes. But again, I'd be really interested to hear your views on that.
Well, I mean, I'm part of a movement called Social Care Future. I help convene that and do that work. And I think we see relationships as dead center to that. Fundamental thing, though, is the kind of movement as a whole, recognize that what unifies it is not to see itself and the people involved in it as caring for other people, but to see its starting point as caring about what other people care about and working alongside them to achieve it, which is a very different conception.
I
think that embodies the idea of personal assistance. I think the idea of personal assistance, that being sort of devoid of a human relationship, is a bit odd in a way. You listen to someone like Clinton Farquharson, who will sort of say, he rejects the idea of there being a skill set for care workers. He is very much of the view that he will recruit his PAs based on things like shared interests, and shared values and things like that. Well, those are that's the basis of a relationship. Doesn't mean he's trying to find a friendship, but he's trying to find something that isn't a transaction. It's about something where there's kind of a shared goals and things like that. I also think, I was chatting to somebody the other day about this, and it's a really weird analogy, but I was saying, when was the last time you set off somewhere, you didn't know where you were going, and didn't first put the address into Google Maps, and Google Maps threw up the direction, you just follow the directions all the way there? That for me is the essence of what personal assistance is and why it's different from care. It's not an end, it's a means to an end. And we're all in some way or another rely on supports to achieve our life goals. We're not islands, we don't do everything on our own. And again, I think it's easier if we see support within this kind of wider web of supports, this ecosystem of supports that all of us rely on to achieve our life goals. And we have to sort of move away from this exceptionalism, like he or she needs care, and that somehow marks that person out as different. I think that's what we can do. But I find it odd to think that there would be devoid of relationships. And to address the point that came up, I think, I sense that people in the field of social work have gone through a phase where they've sort of talk about not traversing these professional boundaries, and some real progressive thinkers are beginning to question that and say we need to be really assertive about things like love and care and relationships, and not be ashamed of these words and these ideas, because they're the essence of being human, really.
No, that's really interesting. As I said earlier, I think there's going to be lots of different touch points and interesting areas to discuss, but sort of bring it back to where we were. So I mean, you mentioned that the political side and the policy layer came a bit later on. I mean, how did that happen? Was that like a personal reading or interactions, or did it come via a newer job or career path that you took as well?
It was a mix. So as I said, because I'd got this initial grounding, I was then I was traversing these professional boundaries on a daily basis and going getting drunk with a lot of disabled people on a regular manner, and listening to people talking about their lives. And I mean, the fundamental thing was I was in my early 20s, they were in their early 20s.
Yeah.
What do people in their early 20s want to do? We all wanted the same things, but what did that group of people encounter that I didn't? What you would call now disabling barriers. What did I encounter? A lack of a social network and friendships, things like that. Again, back to these kind of reciprocal needs.
Yeah.
So there was kind of that politicization through those personal relationships and being with people and listening to what they were experiencing and going out with them and being in a restaurant with somebody or being at the cinema or wherever it might be. But then I think my boss or my director at the time gave me a copy of Mike Oliver's book, and that suddenly, it kind of put it in a framing then, and I understood that. And that was about the time the first Disability Discrimination Act came into force.
95-ish.
Yeah, 94, 95. And then I began working on that. So I began to do a lot of delivery of training courses. Before the Disability Rights Commission came along, there was this sort of delivery of training across CABs and advice agencies around the country. And I got co-opted to do a lot of that. And then moving into advice for the housing sector about how it could meet its obligations under the DDA. And then I began doing more policy-oriented work around health and social care, and then around the built environment and transport and things like that. So I was kind of moving around these different areas. But the legal principle of non-discrimination, the sort of theoretical framework, the social model of disability, and a sort of sense of injustice that needed to be kind of fixed. And that was several years, and then the Disability Rights Commission was established, and I went there after about a year, and then actually worked in education for a few years, which I hadn't done before. So I was jumping around these different kind of fields and areas. And then I was its head of policy for its last 4 years, which is where I met Jane Campbell.
Yeah, she was on a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
No, that's true. It's great. And so you said about the Disability Rights Commission, for those that are not as up on what that was and when it was, could you just explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so, one of the real deficits in the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995, apart from the fact that it was incomplete and there was areas of life like education that just weren't covered, was it had no enforcement body. So there was this kind of thing called the National Disability Council that existed for a few years. It was an advisory thing, but there was no body like the Commission for Racial Equality or the Equal Opportunities Commission around gender equality, and that was seen as a real problem. So when Labour won in 97, they set up a task force to try and look at these gaps and these areas for development. And one of their chief and early recommendations was there should be a body to promote and enforce the law. So the Disability Rights Commission was that. It was set up in 2000. It ran till 2007 when it was replaced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And its job was really to see in the implementation or the rest of the legislation. So as I said, it's coverage of education, of transport, plugging gaps around housing, the public sector equality duties or the disability equality duty as it was. But also, as we kind of moved into the second phase of that, we began to look beyond just the anti-discrimination law to look at the kind of wider range of factors which seem to impinge on whether or not disabled people could enjoy equal life chances. So particularly independent living, levels of poverty and the way the welfare state and employment was operating and things like that. So we did have a kind of wider look. So that was that. And then I moved at Jane's behest, actually, to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I was there for 4 and a bit years.
And is that what sort of swallowed a bit of emotive? But I know with always these narratives that there's certain things I've read over the years that are quite emotional or emotive, but did the DRC become part of the EHRC?
No, I think this was one of the things. There was a lot of it is about framing. There's a sort of sense that the EHRC was a merger, and it was insofar as it took a number of the staff and it took on a number of the functions. But I think it's much more accurate to see it as having been a replacement. It was something quite different in the way it operated and the way it functioned, and for good or ill, a lot of people were really sad to see the Disability Rights Commission go. And
I read Sir Bert Massey's memoir that obviously was finished posthumously. But yeah, it was that was part where I've read some about that era and what happened, and I know he referred to that sadness of when it was shut down.
Yeah. No, I think he's right. I think we all sort of felt it, but I think my sadness having gone there. So Jane Baroness Campbell had been appointed as a commissioner, and one of the things that Sir Bert had negotiated was that there should be this disability committee within the HRC, and actually within the law, it should have statutory force. And the argument was that disability rights was a new kid on the block. It needed further focus. We were still in an early stage. There was distinctive features to the law and how it worked. So there needs to be this thing. So they wanted somebody to go over there as the organisation was being set up to support Jane in developing this committee. I've told this story before, but I wasn't really consulted about whether the person to go was me. And I didn't know Jane very well at the time. I just knew she was quite mischievous. And I don't know if you've watched a TV series called The League of Gentlemen, but there's a character in it called Papa Lazarou, whose catchphrase is, "You're my wife now, Dave." And I was sat at my desk in the Disability Rights Commission. The door came open from the boardroom. There'd been a board meeting. And Jane came zooming over with this look on her face, came up to my desk and said, "You're my wife now, Dave." She just negotiated that I was going with her to the HRC. So yeah, and I didn't really know Jane before that. That was the kind of start of quite a strong relationship between the two of us, and trying as far as we could to build on the legacy of the DRC, but also recognizing that it was within a completely new setting and a set of rules and a different way of working. We had to chart a different path, and also we had some new tools. I mean, the DRC didn't have a explicit human rights remit. It hadn't paid much attention at all to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So that was something that we focused a lot on. So we were able to do some new things, but clearly there was never going to be that level of focus and attention and profile to disability that a single body could give it, really. And I don't think this ever really got back to that. Although my sense is it's been and it's odd. Maybe hopefully it's always seen as more honest, because I'm saying I felt it's been more focused and more effective on disability rights in the last few years, far more than when I was there for the first few, where it was a real struggle to kind of establish that focus.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Just a couple of comments coming in from the viewers. Chris is saying a good PA carer will understand the balance between a friend and an employee, share common interests, help and harness that relationship, which I think was what we were really saying before as well. And Zoe says hello from downstairs, Neil. Zoe Hallam.
Hi, Zoe.
Small world, eh? Cool. So yeah, in terms of just a couple of things I wanted to bring up from people watching, and people watching, keep sending any questions you've got for Neil, any thoughts and experience. Gavin is saying well expressed views, Neil. So yeah, a few very, very agreeable viewers, which is what we like. Although we did like a bit of a discussion as well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have to throw something a bit more contentious out next, Neil. But yeah, I'm sort of keen to get much more, as you've already brought us to, sort of today and COVID-19, but just very quickly, as we were sort of going in before COVID-19, what were your views on, like, was there progress going in what areas, or has it felt quite stagnant for 10 or 20 years as a general sort of thought? And then we'll tackle the COVID-19 stuff.
I think austerity is just if you want to package it up that way, the financial crash of 2008 and the period since then, I think has been problematic in a number of ways. I mean, clearly, and sorry, I'm going to jump around here a bit. There was a speech that Bert gave that I was involved in writing, and he gave it alongside. We kind of, I guess we knew where the direction of travel was going politically in around 2006-07. And so we did this event with David Cameron, we kind of wanted to shake things up a bit. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do this now. This is weird. The Disability Rights Commission got away with murder, to be perfect. But we didn't like the idea that somehow there's a perception that disability rights was just done and dusted. We got the second DDA and the public sector duty, and it's all fine. Because we knew, for example, levels of poverty were there. We knew there was this long-standing underinvestment in social care. We knew about health inequalities. All these problems were there. And we were worried that a kind of complacency would set in because we'd got the law. So we did this did this event, and Bert spoke alongside Cameron. So, I mean, it got a lot of profile because of that, because Cameron was the new leader of the Conservative Party. But there was a line in the speech that I remember really, really well. It's really important. And this is pre-austerity. And Bert said, some disabled people have been invited to look up to the stars while having the rug pulled from beneath them. And what that meant was you had all this kind of raft of equality law, this promise of opportunity, but there were people that were then struggling to get a half-decent social care package, and councils that were putting all their criteria up to critical and substantial levels of need, or people already struggling within the benefit system. So this is kind of 2 or 3 years before, you know, austerity really bites. Those fault lines were already there. And I think the other problem with it was we'd never really put the effort in to try and realign our kind of social welfare system, social care system, with that theory and those aspirations of the equality legislation. So, well, you know this, you know, anyone who has gone through any assessment for social care to access a benefit, whatever else, do you go there and do you say, these are all the amazing qualities I have, these are all the things that I can do? No, people are taught basically to stand there and to put on display their deficits, to emphasize all the things they can't do, to plead their vulnerability.
Yeah.
That's what gives.
I hate that. Yeah.
And that's a complete contradiction in terms. And so the reason I mention that is that then what I think happened, as soon as austerity kicked in, the loudest voices, quite reasonably trying to defend their basic everyday survival, began to push into the foreground these messages largely of vulnerability, of deficit. You know, so all those ideas about disabled people have a lot to offer, a major contribution to make, but really suppressed and right into the foreground instead, for good reason. I'm not criticizing people.
It's sort of like the hardest hit sort of era, that kind of
time, and it's a weird one, because I think at the same time what that revealed was another fault line, which is how the disability rights agenda had not created a platform for the voice of people who have probably felt very marginalized and who since have found an important voice. I think, for example, the Chronic Illness Project is really, really crucial, and crucial because it's looked at the lessons from disability rights and thought about itself and the experience of people connected to it and how it relates to that, but brought a new perspective in the same way you were saying your program yesterday was about people with autism or neurodiversity. You know, all these things have to come in and keep changing and developing it. But I do think what I really mean about the last 10 years is it's done two things damaging. One is it's massively attacked that kind of infrastructure of support that many people need to kind of get on with their life. But at the same time, it's created a discourse about disabled people, which has sort of sidelined the one that had been developed for the previous 20 years, which was about equality and equal life chances, and instead put into the foreground one that's reasserted the idea of disabled people as somehow intrinsically vulnerable and in need of looking after and everything else. And that's just been put on stilts. It's just accelerated in the last 2 months. If you go on Google Analytics, it's really interesting. You'll and put the word vulnerability in. It's like that for kind of years. No, the public don't use this term. In March, it just goes like that. No, so these ideas are getting really reasserted and really crystallized in the public mind, and that worries me a lot. So I think that's a bit of a kind of pessimistic outlook, isn't it? Or more a call to kind of try and find a different language and a different way through to the next stage, you know.
I mean, I on a personal level, I've had the threat and had to fight tooth and nail for social care over the years. So I've experienced that almost having the fundaments and the foundation being taken away from me. But I also know that, you know, different reasons, like I've been able to work and build up the sort of careers I have, has meant that, you know, poverty, for example, hasn't been as much of a challenge. And I've sort of gradually, I've understood the bigger picture and had the empathy and compassion for other parts of the community and the movement. And, you know, obviously realizing it's not that my experience isn't obviously what everyone else has. And that's been, again, like we were talking about at the beginning, a sort of personal journey that I've had to go on. But I know that I've always been more the sort of the positive optimist side as a personality trait, if you like. But I remember around that sort of, it was around 2008 and afterwards, I was very vehemently cut down by that that group you've described, then it makes sense. Like if you're literally not got the ability to get out of bed or to buy your shop and eat, like of course you're going to be like, this is the story that has to be told. But I think I think from what I understood of what you're saying, that both do exist and both can exist in the sense that both of those narratives are real, and it's sort of how we can. Jane talked a lot about unifying the community and how there's almost one voice when talking to government or business, but it is very hard when there's all those very disparate and different experiences as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very, if you take, say, the definition of the Equality Act, it's such a huge, diverse community anyway. I mean, you know, we were just talking earlier about whether or not I would say anything that could be divisive or controversial. I mean, an obvious thing will be, is there one disabled community at all anyway? You know, what do people with HIV/AIDS have in common with people with learning disabilities? You know, I don't know, other than an umbrella of rights that kind of applies. So I suppose there's that question. But I think on this particular point, I think it's that, in my feeling, and I probably lost a number of friends and supporters at the time as well, was that it would have been potentially more powerful to have presented the impacts of austerity as an assault on freedom and rights and on equality, rather than pleading vulnerability. You know, and people didn't go down that path, probably because they were calculating that the language of vulnerability, of kind of compassion, of trying to generate sympathy would be more effective. And maybe those people were right, because that, and I think now in language terms they were possibly right, because I think one big weak spot in the whole of disability rights is that it uses a language which is really cold and unemotional, and it's a bit like that point around, it's almost
like impairment.
Well, impairment or just rights is a kind of dead word, or equality, you know, whereas vulnerability is that kind of human, emotional kind of thing. So I think we have got to find a language which is rooted in values and emotions and speaks to our hearts as well as our minds, but is about rights, is about that kind of vision of the world. But I think we didn't have it at the time. So I think it's natural that people kind of went to there. But I think the danger has been that we end up in a situation where it's almost like equality for some or welfare for everybody else, which is nonsensical. And what the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities does, it gives us a framework that does bring all that together under one kind of heading. And for me, you know, this is coming from the social care future work. I think what unifies us all as human beings is all of us in our lives, we want meaning, we want purpose, we want a sense of connection and belonging. Those tend to be the things that anybody aspires to. And if we start there and then think, what are the things we all need to actually realize those things, because they may be different, then I think we can perhaps sort of begin charting a better path.
Yeah, I agree. And in a way, you know, there's the sort of disabled people are facing barriers and discrimination. So we're trying to label it and name it as a community so we can address the wrongs. And so the way that, like, what's the commonalities within disabled people, in the end, it's actually just, we're just people, right? I think that's kind of what your point speaks to, is like, it's the same with different, you know, religious wars and, you know, borders. Like you look at the earth from space and you just see the land and the seas, and there's not these politically drawn lines that are man-made countries who've created all these narratives of, you know, what it is to have a country and all this sort of stuff. So I know it gets way more philosophical, you go down that road, but the fundamental point is we're all humans and we all have those same traits and beliefs and longings. And I think that's what we need to do, is connect non-disabled people with, or those that don't understand what it is to have a disability, to understand it's just about humanity.
Yeah, I feel like we should be reaching for a spliff here, Martin. But
I did feel when I started going down that road. But I do think it's true, right?
But I do think at the same time, yeah, I think this is the key thing. And the other thing that I've been doing a lot of work on the last several years is about framing. You know, the whole issue about how you frame communications, how you manage. And I think the key starting point every single time has to be to speak to common humanity and then you unpack into what the specifics are. But if what we do every time is we use language that is othering, whether we're talking about the rights of a group or whether we're talking about their vulnerability, what we instantly do is kind of distance that group from everybody else in a way. Whereas if we find the kind of ways in, so this is what we've done with Social Care Future, and we've done it with a big network of people, and we're still doing the research. But we were saying, well, what's our vision? What's social care about? You know, what's this all for? And people just came up with this idea, and it started, you know, we all want to live in the place we call home with the people and things that we love, doing what matters to us in communities where we look out for one another. So it's a simple, universal statement, but it's got everything in it. You know, meaning, purpose, belonging, connection, support. And that's what I think we have to sort of try and do. Then you can say, but there are clearly people that experience inequalities and unequal access to these things. And so as a world that we believe in this for everybody, then it's right that we address those inequalities. But I think if we use a sort of set of language which is always about a kind of a distinct group, and the big lesson here has actually come from LGBT movements. So equal marriage, for example, they consciously shifted from making a civil rights case for gay and lesbian people to be able to have civil partnerships, to talking about equal marriage and invoking messages and images of family. So a lot of the spokespeople for equal marriage were not gay and lesbian people, it was their parents and grandparents. And it was the idea of familial love and being part of community and going on a journey together. These were all the messages that were kind of have won legal concessions for equal marriage around the world. So I think there's a huge lesson to learn from that. And the big one for me, actually, I think we should stop talking about disability rights and start talking about disability equality again as a little basic thing, because I think the language of equality works better than the language of rights, but that's to be tested.
Did you say equality? Yes.
Equality, yeah, disability equality. It was what we talked about through the 2000s, and it got dropped in about 2010. We stopped talking about it, and we've talked about disability rights, but I just think the language of equality is more powerful. It'll just work more effectively.
So there's two thoughts I've got. One is that Zoe and Chris and Gavin have all sort of they've made different comments, but I think certainly Chris and Gavin's is pointing towards, you know, disabled people. If we're always challenging and fighting, this was more Gavin's point, is there a sort of negativity to that always being the sort of, you know, having to fight for stuff? Is that a negative in terms of image? But Chris's point, I think we're all leading to this stage now, is that we have to do the thinking around theories and, like you say, what's worked for other groups that face barriers and discrimination, and like talking through the options. But are you seeing sort of concrete actions that are starting to happen, and that almost, is there a point where we can galvanize the community to a very tangible thing rather than the sort of theoretical side? Big question there.
Yeah, I mean, also, I'm not sure it's. See, I think the other thing for me as a non-disabled person is always been very kind of cautious about, you know, have views and opinions and talk about the law and advice and experience, but some of those questions are not questions for me in a way about what to do. I think I see. Actually, let me just move around that a little bit. I think we are at a position where there is still the case that some of the big charities still hold a lot of the cards in terms of their relationships with government, with parliament, and with the media. Yet, I don't think I've seen anything hugely effective from any of them in campaigning terms for years. Seriously, I just haven't. That doesn't mean I'm not of the view that they don't have a role or they don't do anything useful at all.
It's never binary, is it? Yeah.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think the field of disability, I think there's some really interesting stuff, I should say, from the States. I think the Crip the Vote stuff in the States, I don't know if you follow that. I think that's fascinating. I think there's the whole campaign for the Disability Integration Act in the States, I think is really, really exciting. I think Every Australian Counts, which won the National Disability Insurance Scheme, is really, really exciting. I think perhaps some disability campaigning in the UK, which is largely grown around social media, has been galvanizing, has given people a voice. but it relies too much on protest as the sole way to
Yeah,
influence
yeah.
change. And protest is everything. But, you know, if there's one hero from the disability movement for me who's sadly not with us anymore, is Caroline Gooding.
Mhm.
And the genius of Caroline Gooding was she was a disabled woman who would tie herself to a bus on Westminster Bridge and block the traffic. And then when the protest finished, she would walk into the DWP in Caxton House and sit down around a table and help draft the Disability Discrimination Act with them.
Mm.
And that ability to be both a kind of, you know, an agitator, a protester for change, and to look at all these levers, but also to be there co-producing change. And I know that's an unreasonable thing to say where you have a government that seems unwilling to invite people in to play that kind of role. But recognizing that influencing change comes from a whole range of different angles and movements, whether it's what you're doing. You know, I don't think putting forward this kind of aspirational view of how life can be and kind of inviting people to talk about that and to pursue it, for me, that is absolutely a fundamental element of influencing social change. You have to give people a vision of how the world can be, not just how it isn't right now.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm jumping around here. So I think there's lots of different stuff, but I think I can think of some international stuff that's gone on and has been very successful. And I can think about some stuff that's quite specific, but not generic. So maybe that's the other issue. Kind of small scale targeted focus campaigns about particular things are more effective than some kind of huge change the world kind of campaign.
Yeah,
And this campaign for changing places, for example, been hugely effective. I mean, really sort of powerful as a specific campaign. I think probably led by parents of disabled children, actually. But I think something like that, which is using, you know, there's a clear solution, very clear, tangible idea. People recognize the issue, understand the inconvenience and the injustice caused by not having that, and they've kind of won change.
So what of the, because I think I totally agree with everything you're saying. What jumped out at me is that need for focus, but maybe on something bigger that moves the needle more in some way. So like, could you see any particular issues that would be, you know, where you would love to see there being more focus from the rights, from the disability rights movement or the equality movement?
Well, I mean, I'm involved in it at the minute. I think
Social care, right?
Well, independent living. I think social care is, I mean, as a term, we're using it because that's the kind of dominant sort of terminology. But for me, it's the kind of it's the logical way to unify. The point we were talking about before, it unifies the idea of people having equal rights to experience, you know, non-discrimination, self-determination, all these things, but recognizing that that only works if it's underscored by people having access to support and resources, financial and practical assistance to kind of realize those things. So intellectually, I find it attractive. And philosophically, I think it's the kind of right way forward. And I think it would be the basis to sort of build a new agenda moving forward. I think where work is needed on that is about framing, about how it's communicated. I think, unfortunately, for most people, when they hear the word independence, the ideas that they associate that with that will come into their heads are standing on your own 2 feet, fleeing the, you know, it's all about self-sufficiency. And so we have instances where councils cut people's support because they're promoting their independence. It's this really problematic. So I think we have to find a better language and a better way. It always depresses me really, that whenever you read a definition of independent living, it'll say the first line and then immediately explain all the things it isn't. I think if you have to explain all the things something isn't, then it's obviously not a good way of describing what it is to begin with. So I think we've got to find a new language. But I just think it could be just really, really galvanizing and a real opportunity to create a real focus for campaigning. And in fairness, I'm saying this, people like Rofer, that is their big focus, a right to independent living. That is what they want to see and what they have prioritized. So it's not me just sort of saying this. But I think it'll take some real leadership and effort to build a social movement for change in that direction. But there's a huge amount of support for that, you know, beyond the disability movement. A lot of people thinking in similar terms about a very different future and way of the way things should operate and function. terms of public services, in terms of the relationship between citizens and state, the role for communities, the role of social networks, all these kind of ideas. There's a real opportunity right now, I think, to get in there and to sort of shape that. And COVID-19 has really brought it to the fore with the whole kind of growth of mutual aid movements and networks, and people really using their own ideas and agency to make change in their own communities. That my only fear with that, and other people fear this, and I think there'll be a kind of effort to turn it around. There's a risk that even within that, because there's these groups that are vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable, you end up with an idea that there are groups that need help over here and groups providing help over there. And to come back to the very beginning of our conversation today, that's what we will kind of need to break down.
Symbiosis.
Over the next kind of decade, hopefully we'll move beyond the kind of the pandemic itself, but it's going to have a hugely long tail socially and economically, and a lot of people are going to need a lot of support for years to come as a result of the impacts of it. Imagine a situation where tens of thousands, millions of people that have been far less able to reciprocate the support they've received because they've had to shield or stay indoors, want to kind of give back to their communities. How can you really harness that and use that as a way to create social interaction between people that might not otherwise interact with one another, to break down these ideas around who is the giver or receiver of support, to completely blend all of that? I think that's quite an exciting possibility in front of us, but it would again take a fair degree of effort to kind of get there.
No, that makes sense. I was thinking, like, we talked about the wording. Like, one thing I've heard about equality is almost this notion that no one wants the same thing, and I think the idea of equality is that it's the equal opportunities, isn't it? It's the level playing field. But I wonder if that's one of the not the downsides, but the sort of difficulties with adopting that word, is some people think, oh, it means we all have to be the same, and that's not what obviously we're trying to achieve. What do you think of the word inclusion?
I think it's fine. I think, again, it's one of those words that doesn't mean anything to people. I mean, this is the problem about independent living. If independent living is supposed to be a word that aspires to equality, well, when was the last time you ever heard a non-disabled person or a person that doesn't use any support ever refer to independent living as anything conscious? We talked about finding that common humanity. So I think we have to find language and ideas that people can relate to and understand. We have to find metaphors that are relatable, and we're using a whole set of language which is, its objectives are right, because inclusion is about being part of the wider, right to be in the world, being part of that community. But I'm really honest, I have a non-disabled daughter. I never refer to her inclusion. Do I? So why we're doing that? So I think it's sort of professionalizing ideas and language, and it sort of, in a way, reinforces the othering. So I think we have to find a different sort of thing. Theoretically, yes, I think that's more important. I think the danger is we have, as you say, an idea of equality which is about sameness, and feminist thinking has challenged that completely. The aspiration shouldn't be for women to live in a world completely shaped by men. That's not the point. It's to reshape the world. And for me, that's the idea of disability rights as well. It's not about just having access to the same things. It's about having a seat round the table in order to shape the world so it's more inclusive and more egalitarian and more open to everybody. So I think in that sense, yes, but I think we have to find a better language to describe it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, obviously I've in more recent years gone more and more into the business side, because I think I can see that with business, there's a way of creating more employment if businesses understand disabled people as untapped talent and all that, the whole narrative. And the same with, from an economic sense of, if your goods and services are accessible and inclusive, then you untap a whole market that has previously been ignored or underserved at best. So for me, that does shift the needle, and the way that I've felt that I'm getting a lot more traction, and very much, as you say, it's about collaboration. It's working with lots of other different people with different skills and different experiences, but it's been understanding, if you're a business, there's a baseline. You know, a business in itself is driven to make profit, so you want to look at how disabled people getting a seat at the table, as you've just quite rightly. I love that phrase about just having a seat at the table makes sense from a business perspective. So with that way of thinking, turning it to government, and you mentioned earlier, it feels like this government don't generally sort of looking to have disabled people around the table as much as they should. But is there a way of using that same approach with business? So what is the government looking to achieve, and how do we get disabled people to fit in that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we've not talked about it in any sort of depth yet, but I've touched on before the language of vulnerability and how I think that's dominated this period and has been growing for some time, and how problematic I feel it is. And I'm stepping carefully here because, you know, there's been this whole stuff about so-called inspiration porn.
Yeah.
The reality is, and it was kind of what I was alluding to before, disabled people are as fallible as everybody else. There are disabled people that are a pain in the arse. There are disabled people that are...
on a podcast over the weekend. I was like, some of us are bastards. Like that's life,
you know what I mean? So
right?
I'm not, and you know, so I'm not. The idea of generalizing is unhelpful. On the other hand, my experience of disabled people throughout my personal and professional life is of people that use ingenuity. People are creative at finding solutions, people that are incredibly resilient, people who endure things that the rest of the community couldn't even dream of having to endure psychologically, socially, physically, etc., etc. These are just this basket of strengths, this huge kind of strength that's there. And then we label that same group of people vulnerable. And vulnerable means weak, defenseless, and everything else, right? So I think that's the thing. Tap into people's ingenuity, their creativity, and whatever. If you're a government, as this one is, you're a conservative government, and you're talking about releasing everybody's potential, and you're interested in prosperity and drive and change, then those are the messages. And you don't need to attach that to business and just a profit motive. You attach it to anything. You know, we need those things to deal with climate change. We need those things to come up with a sustainable future for social care. We need those things to resolve health inequalities, whatever it might be. So I think I come back again to sort of framing and kind of ideas and what people bring to the table. And I don't think those qualities and those things, which, you know, they're not in everyone, as we just said, but they are there. And I think
you're right.
Not to look at people, and the reason I think it's worth attaching that to a range of issues is not to make the question just one of people's economic value and their relative productivity, because I think that's dangerous and divisive. But to more generally just sort of look at kind of a broader range of qualities that people have and how those qualities can be relied upon and drawn into the kind of the needs of the wider community for a better society. I think that's a different way of kind of framing. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm waffling.
It does, yeah. So I'm mindful we're sort of getting into one now as well, but I guess probably the last question is, do disabled people, because Jane said there's still a place for being offline and going, a bit like you mentioned, sort of, you know, chain into buses and that, like, do we need that again, some kind of civil disobedience so that we can get to the table and then have this discussion of co-production of commonalities?
I don't know. I don't know how to answer
I appreciate it. It's like your opinion. It's just what you.
Well, it's not so much that I don't know. I'm not saying you don't need it. I think you always need everything, and really, what you need is a good theory of change.
Do we have enough of it at the moment? Like, because again, it's something we touched on with Jane, that because of the social media giving people a voice, there are these sort of echo chambers of different impairment groups, you know, the community and, you know, the lifestyle disabled people and the political activity, but it's all online. So do we maybe need to get more that offline vibe going?
Oh, I see, right. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in this world it's a bit hard, isn't it? But yeah, I certainly think I think people kind of getting together and and meeting is profoundly important wherever people can. I think the thing is, the flip though is the benefit of social media has meant that literally you've seen people campaigning from their beds.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful and so democratized. I think the other thing about Twitter and other forms of social media is they've allowed people to cut straight past the well-funded press offices of big charities and go straight to journalists and form relationships with them, straight to MPs and so.
Yeah.
So we live in a world which gives us a lot more kind of access to power. And a lot of the campaigning, look at the Me Too movement. That wasn't organized. It's a hashtag. It just builds and expands, but it can expire as quickly. And I suppose the question is, you still, I think, need to strategize. You still have to sit down and think about the long-term change that's needed and how you're going to build a movement for that change, who you're going to need to influence, who you're going to reach. And I just wonder whether that leadership is there. I think that's the issue. But the other thing I will say just before we go is, and it links to the point you asked me before about whether there's any particular movements that I think are powerful or influential. I kind of wonder whether the future really is in a campaign of and by disabled people, or whether it's, again, disabled people seat around the table in a number of other kind of campaigns. Because, if you look where the kind of the big areas of focus are, like climate change, for example, which will have a profound impact on all of our lives, but is going to lead to policy changes, for example, not having cars in city centres and things like that, with a huge impact on disabled people's lives. Are disabled people actively involved in those wider campaigns? And for me, that's probably more where the future lies, less about single identity campaigning, and more about disabled people having a more prominent role across a range of different fields and things, whether it's about changing the way the social security system works and the whole debates that are emerging around universal basic income, whether it's about climate change, whether it's about the future of social care, which is overly dominated by sector organisations and largely, it's wrong, but largely the interests of older people. That for me is what interests me. And in a way, I sometimes think some of the old guard of the disability rights movement missed this, that actually they were really, really successful. And they've opened up lots of opportunities for people like you and other people to kind of do the things that you're doing that they wouldn't have been able to do when they were younger. And they should be celebrated for that, but they shouldn't expect you to campaign in the same way. I think your future is kind of doing what you're doing. You're going out influencing business, and you're not preoccupied necessarily with disability rights. You're preoccupied with people having a good time. It's kind of your brain's somewhere else, and I think good. And sorry, that's a very kind of half formulated set of thoughts.
That makes sense.
There's a brilliant quote in 1980, I think it was the World Year in Action on Disability by UN. And there's a quote in there, and somebody wrote, "As we have equal rights, so we will have equal responsibilities. It will be our obligation to take part in the building of society." And I love that quote. And I think what it meant was, as these opportunities open up and as disabled people enjoy more rights, more equal citizenship, then there'll be this expectation people play a much broader and wider role in the whole range of kind of things that go on. I think that is happening. We see it all the time.
You've got my... Sorry to interrupt you. You got my brain sparking off, because I'm looking at like Chris, who's commented a couple of times, just trying to get wheelchair users to go on aeroplanes in the wheelchair, and Gavin, is doing a lot of great work using tech to connect disabled people with retail and sort of having better customer services. And you're talking, I think, a little bit there about having representation on public boards and generally where there is design and creation of what the world looks like in many, many, many different ways. It's just having the right, so that not just a disabled person tokenistically, obviously, but someone that's got that career and experience in that very niche area. And so maybe it's already happening, which is kind of good, but maybe someone needs to be able to look at that more strategically, like where are there gaps and how do we move resources around, and how do we make a noise with the press and the government that we are strategically doing this. It's a more formulated approach as opposed to the moment I feel like it's just people are doing it very naturally of their own accord, and you might be able to bring funding and training and support for those people and those leaders as well.
Yeah, I think certainly, and you look at what Disability Rights UK was doing a few years ago about future leaders and leadership. I think that's really the way to go. But I think it's it's also how do you create networks between those people that are already in those positions to bring
Yeah.
other people behind them. But it was, sorry, I was waffling away, but it was kind of, your question was, you were talking about having worked in business and the importance of that. I just think it's everything. Social change. There isn't a hierarchy. You don't change the law and then the world changes. Everything has to be changed at once, and you have to work across all of these things. And the power of consumers in their interaction with shops, or the flip side of that, a customer goes into a shop and they're served by a disabled person, and what does that do to their perception when they leave the shop? It's all about those interactions and those changes and those positions of power and influence, and harnessing them and trying to grow them and use them to kind of optimum effect. So I don't think there is one theory of change. I think protest is fine, but I think also a high number of disabled consumers complaining about about a supermarket chain and how it operates can be really powerful, or strategic litigation can be really powerful, or some bad press for an airline can be really powerful, or some good press for an airline can be really, really powerful.
It's all
of them. Yeah, but I think the issue is, do we need somebody to be coordinating that and offering strategic leadership to try and harness all that, or is it an entirely organic process? And if it's the former, who's there to do that? It's felt to me a bit like a slightly rudderless ship for a number of years, and I don't know. I can't work out in my head whether that's a bad thing or it's just how it is.
But I think your point about collaboration and networks, I was invited to connect with an entrepreneur network, and the idea is that I will get to just meet and support and be supported by all sorts of other entrepreneurs. But I, from that, could look to set up a disabled entrepreneurs initiative and connect all the disabled entrepreneurs out there. But it's, in a way, the leadership is the framework to connect and support and speed up that symbiosis and that connection. Maybe whether in the past it was one person that gave sermons from a hill,
Yeah, but that's it. That's that kind of idea of connectivity is key, isn't it, to everything at the minute, and it'll suddenly amplify and accelerate things really, really quickly. If you think like in the early 90s, how long it took people to get a copy of The Politics of Disablement, where you could hashtag and get that to tens of thousands of people in an afternoon. It's sort of ideas spread fast. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But I guess the question I haven't resolved is whether or not we're just at a moment where this will rightly happen in a very diffused way, and there'll just be lots of different people doing their own kind of things in different fields, and that will make, or whether there is something missing, which is something to tie all that together. I don't know what the answer to that is. That was where we were in the past, and it achieved a lot of change. Whether we're beyond that now, or whether it's just a missing link right now, I think it's a question for a discussion another time.
It is, and I think, just final thought on all that, your point about not just in disability rights or any civil rights, but in the world culturally, it was very hierarchical and top down years ago, generations ago. And so I think that general change in the way the world is, and that more flatter hierarchy, is also why it's just different. And I think because there needed to be that civil rights movement and win, like when you said that there's not the hierarchy of what is more important or less important, but if I'm being really honest with you, I've always felt like if I'm not working on the politics of disability, it's somehow not as worthy. It really became into my consciousness when you said that. And as you said, it's all important, right? But I know that, and others still view it that way, that if you're not doing the government bit, you're not really an activist,
I mean, I think a couple of years ago, I remember in the midst of austerity, every Friday I'd get the email from John Pring bringing together all the stories about it, and they were so, they weren't, I'm not saying they were inaccurate or wrong, but they were just so dark and so miserable and so depressing to read. They were awful. And I remember one Friday night, I just thought, it's nothing good happened. I mean, is there nothing people can point to where they would say their lives of disabled people have got better? So I just did this completely unscientific polling on Twitter for a few days. And lots of people did point to lots of things that felt improved. So not uniformly, but a lot of people saying London felt public transport was infinitely better than it had been 20 years ago. But the one thing that everybody pointed to was technology, how liberating technology had been. And the question there is, has that change happened because of politics and law or something else, or a number of different kind of factors? Why has technology often been repurposed? Wasn't necessarily designed to achieve certain results. People have taken it, used it to other ends. That in the end has influenced the designers of technology and its commissioners and so on to think more about inclusive design and those sorts of things. But that's a process of change, which I don't think you could just say is because of law. It might be regulation, but I think it's a mix. So I think for me, it's never one thing or the other. It's a mix of things that bring change. Ditto, you look at to the extent that buildings are to a degree more accessible, or the high street will be more accessible. Is that down to the laws and regulation? Is it down to more savvy consumers? Is it down to the fact that shops want to project that idea and that image of themselves more now than they ever used to do? And if they do, why is that? Because they obviously see a market advantage, and the market advantage isn't having more disabled consumers necessarily. It's having more consumers generally. They think projecting that image is going to be beneficial to how they're kind of seen. And you want to harness that, don't you? Because that's a real engine of change. You want to leave that and say, oh, no, that's no good because it's not all rooted in regulation and the DDA or the Equality Act. It's like, forget that. That's just the baseline. If they want to go further than that because it's a good thing, then we need that, surely. So, that was a very long way of saying I don't think it's one thing or the other. I think it's everything.
But back to leadership, maybe someone or some group or some project needs to sort of get everyone doing their different thing to realize they are all doing valuable work towards a greater point, and they're not, because I sometimes think there is a bit them and us within the approach to equality. So it's about bringing all that sort of different disparate groups, not just by impairment, but by activist approach, if you like, that to feel part of something bigger.
I mean, I am going to say something controversial at the end. I think there are a number of groups that are sort of sitting around writing resolutions and setting out the demands in statements and thinking that wins change. I think the fundamental question you have to ask from an evidence-based point of view is what changes the world. You might have a vision of how you want the world to be. That's not enough. You have to have a kind of real route to get in there.
How,
and how you get there, So, if an organization is saying to you, because you didn't turn up to a meeting and sign up to their 12-point list of demands, you're not legitimate, I would just turn around and say, well, point to the change that's come from that. Because you're managing to kind of change things. So that's not to delegitimize that process and the demand behind. But for me, the key question is, how do you win change? Not how do you state the change that you want and how do you articulate that? Because if no one's listening and paying attention, it doesn't matter a jot. So I think that's where the focus has to always be, and that's where I think people need to be very open-minded and open to as wider range of potential levers and strategies as possible. Otherwise, what's the point, really?
Yeah, agreed. It's diversity in every sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Gavin said, hell yes, I'm on the barricades with you, Neal.
Yeah, okay. On the barricades of consuming.
Cool. Well, we have run over a bit, but I mean, that's been really interesting.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time and insights, Neal. Where can people follow you? Where's the best place to sort of follow your work and get involved with what you're up to?
Well, I'm overactive on Twitter, though. I won't read the last few days. It's just been me shouting about Dominic Cummings. So, but yeah, I'm on Twitter. I have my own blog called Making Rights Make Sense. And as I said, the main project that I'm involved with and passionate about at the minute is Social Care Future. I'm kind of working on a piece of work on that to try and change the whole narrative around social care to build a better future for it, really. So all of those things. So Twitter is Neal M. Crowther. Making Rights Make Sense is my blog, and then Social Care Future is the big project I'm working on at the moment.
Brilliant. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for watching. And if you're watching the replay, still feel free to, pop some questions down. I'll keep an eye if anything pops up, and I'll let you know, Neal. But
Great.
yeah, it's great chat. Thanks again, Neal, and see you soon.
Cheers. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.